The unseen shadow. It wasn't until Sarah moved into her new apartment that she first noticed the strange shadows. The apartment was old, the kind of building that had history carved into its walls. Floors creaked, pipes groaned in the night, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. It was an apartment filled with character, charming in a way, though it made her skin crawl more than once. It had been on the market for a while, so when Sarah signed the lease, she had been glad to get it for such a good price. But it didn't take long before the apartment began feeling ... wrong at first. It was subtle, just a flicker in her peripheral vision, a shadow moving across the corner of her room as the light shifted. She chalked it up to a trick of the light, a reflection from the old street lamps outside, or perhaps just fatigue. She'd been moving in for days, and exhaustion had set in. But as the days passed, the strange shadowy figures became more noticeable. They weren't like normal shadows. They were too alive. They began to appear at night, darker than the surrounding. Dark, almost as though they were absorbing the light around them. The first few nights, she thought it was just her imagination. But then the shadows started to move. They crept along the edges of her room, never fully in sight, always just out of the corner of her eye. She would catch a glimpse of them, then quickly turn her head to see nothing at all, only the walls and furniture bathed in the dim light of her lamp. But they were there. She felt them. Sarah had always prided herself on being practical, a woman who didn't believe in things she couldn't see, yet something about those shadows gnawed at her sanity. She began to notice how they lingered near her bed at night, lingering longer and longer as she lay there, eyes wide open. Too terrified to move, the whispers started shortly. At first, it was just the softest sound, scratching, like something tiny scraping along the walls or the floorboards. But it didn't stop. It continued in the dark, growing louder and more persistent. Each night, the sound was closer, more insistent. She would sit up in bed, heart pounding, staring into the pitch-black room, straining to hear it. In terror, it was coming from the corners where the shadows lurked. The weight of the air in her room grew thick. She felt it pressing down on her chest at night, the darkness itself wrapping around her, suffocating her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. One night, the shadows were so thick, so present, she almost swore she saw something in them. A form, figure. But when she tried to focus, it was gone. Vanished like smoke. She couldn't take it anymore. Desperate for answers, Sarah decided to set up a camera in her room. She had to know what was happening, to see what these things were, what these shadows were. It was something physical, some trick of light or some kind of reflection, or maybe it was something more. She set up the camera facing the corner, where she'd noticed the shadows moving the most. She left it recording, then crawled into bed, trying to block out the feeling of something watching her.
Ow.
Trying to ignore the scratching that had started again, now louder, as though it was crawling beneath her skin. The next morning she rushed to the camera. Her hands shook as she replayed the footage. At first it seemed normal, just the shadows of the room, the flickering of the lamp, and the slow movement of the dust in the air. But then, as the night deepened, something changed. The shadows began to move. They slithered along the walls, writhing like snakes in the dark. They gathered in the corners, growing darker and more distinct, and Sarah felt her breath catch in. Her throat as she watched them watching her. She could see them moving, their forms twisting and stretching in impossible ways. They didn't belong. They were alive. And then at the end of the footage, something happened. A shadow detached from the others, and it moved toward her bed, crawling slowly, deliberately across the floor. It reached the edge of her bed, where she had been lying, sleeping. For a long moment, the shadow just hovered there, before it whispered. The sound was unmistakable, a soft rasp, as though it came from 1,000 dry voices in the dark. You cannot hide. The camera shook, as though the room itself had been struck. And then the shadows retreated, vanishing back into the corners of the room, leaving the bed empty, save for Sarah, who lay there unaware. She felt her blood run cold as the screen flickered and went black the next day. Sarah was gone. The apartment was just as it had been the night before, untouched, unchanged. Her things were still there, her clothes folded neatly, her personal belongings untouched. The bed was empty, the blanket tossed to the side, but the camera, when the landlord came to inspect it, wasn't. The footage had been erased. All that remained was a faint flickering on the screen, a few minutes of static and then nothing. The neighbors said they didn't hear anything. The landlady couldn't understand why Sarah had disappeared so suddenly without a trace.
It was
As though she had simply evaporated into the air, like the shadows that had haunted her. Months later, the apartment was rented again. The whispers had stopped. The shadows. They were still there, and the new tenant, like Sarah before them, soon learned that the shadows in that apartment weren't just a trick of the light. They were something else, something alive, something hungry. But by then, it was already too late. The forgotten song, that edge of town, tucked away between a dusty bookstore and a crumbling cafe, there was an old antique store place that time had forgotten. The shelves were crowded with oddities, faded paintings, chipped china, tarnished. Silverware, but it was the music box that caught Aaron's eye. It sat alone on a wooden pedestal in the back corner of the store, its brass keys slightly tarnished, its delicate carvings worn by years of neglect. The storekeeper, an old man with thick glasses and a smile that barely moved, had barely looked up when Aaron approached the counter. That one, the shopkeeper had muttered, his voice a raspy whisper. It's been here for years. No one's bought it. Some say it's cursed. Aaron chuckled. He wasn't one for superstition, and the idea of a cursed music box seemed as absurd as it was quaint. He was a young man, eager to fill the emptiness in his new apartment, and the music box seemed like a harmless trinket. It had an elegant beauty, a faded charm, and the price was right. $5, the shopkeeper said, barely meeting his eyes. Take it if you want it. Without a second thought, Aaron handed over the money and took the music box. He didn't know why, but something about it felt ... old. Older than the store. Older than the town itself. That night, he set it on the windowsill of his new apartment. The moonlight shone through the dirty window, casting long shadows across the room. As Aaron wound the key, the little song that played was beautiful, soft, haunting, and oddly familiar. He couldn't place it, but it seemed to speak to something deep inside him. He sat there, listening to the gentle notes as the night crept in around him. But as the music played, something changed. The colors in the room seemed to dull, like the light had been filtered through a fog. The air became heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. The shadows, once ordinary, stretched unnaturally, creeping across the walls like dark living things. Aaron tried to shake it off. The song was just that, a song. But the unease lingered, a strange sensation that he couldn't shake. The box down and blew out the candle on the table. The room returned to normal, the shadows retreating to their corners, the air lightening once more. For the next few days, Aaron couldn't stop thinking about the music box. He placed it back on the windowsill, wound it up, and listened again. The song was still beautiful, still haunting. But each time it played, the same shift happened. Subtle, but real. The world around him would darken, the atmosphere would thicken, and the shadows would stretch further, longer. Soon, he couldn't stop himself. He began winding the music box more frequently, playing the tune over and over, as if it were a drug he couldn't quit. And each time, the world would shift. Air grew heavier, the shadows longer. And always, when the music stopped, there was a brief moment of silence, a moment that seemed to stretch forever. One night, Aaron's obsession with the music box reached its peak. He had wound it up and listened to the song more times than he could count, but this time something felt different. The room seemed quieter, the shadows more sinister. As the final note of the song played, something in the room shifted, not the air, not the shadows, but something else. Aaron felt his heart skip a beat as the music. The box clicked to a stop. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and then nothing. Aaron blinked. The room was darker. The shadows in the corners of the room had deepened, stretching farther than they should have. Now the air was thick with an unnatural heaviness, and the colors around him seemed faded, as if the vibrancy of the world had been drained away. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish. He tried to speak, but no sound came. His mind screamed. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. He reached out for the music box, but his hands were unresponsive. He watched, helpless, as the shadows around him seemed to shift, moving closer, pressing in. A chill crawled up his spine as he felt the presence of something else in the room, something behind the shadows. Something dark, something alive. The last thing he heard before. Everything went black was a whisper, just a faint rustle of sound. It was a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. You shouldn't have listened. The next morning, the apartment was silent. The music box sat on the windowsill, untouched. But when the landlord came to collect the rent, he found the apartment locked from the inside. He knocked, but there was no answer. He called, but there was no response. Finally, he broke the door down, only to find the room empty. Save for the music box, Aaron was gone. The police were called. There were no clues, no signs of struggle, and no explanation. His belongings were still there, his clothes folded neatly in the corner. The music box was the only thing out of place. They searched the entire town, even the woods behind it, but Aaron was never found. Some say that the song played in the wind. On certain nights, soft and haunting, carried from the window of the apartment. Others say that the music box was a portal, an invitation to a world where the shadows took what they wanted, what they needed. But one thing was certain, the tune would never fade, and the town, its people, and its memories would all eventually be swallowed by the whispers in the dark. The forgotten song was still playing. The Whispering Woods legend had it that the woods behind the Sinclair farm were cursed. The old folks in town would speak of them in hushed tones, shaking their heads and muttering about things that happened in the dark of night. Strange things, things you couldn't explain. They said that no one had ever ventured too far into the trees and lived to tell about it. The woods were thick with old pines and twisted oaks, their branches heavy with moss. No matter how hard you tried, it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was always watching. And no one stayed after dark, not for long anyway. The sun would set, and the shadows would stretch across the ground like fingers reaching for something or someone. Mark Sinclair had heard the stories all his life. He had grown up on the farm that sat on the edge of those very woods. His father had warned him about the place. His mother had whispered prayers every time they passed by the trees. And his sister Lily, who was always more curious than cautious, had often ventured just beyond the tree line, daring the darkness to reach out and claim her. But when Lily vanished without a trace, the whispers of the woods took on a new, more personal tone. No one knew where she had gone. No footprints, no signs of struggle. One moment she was playing in the yard, and the next gone. It wasn't like Lily to run off, and Mark knew something had to have happened. His parents had been beside themselves with worry, but the search parties that went into the woods came back empty-handed, their faces pale and taut with fear. The more they searched, the more they avoided the deeper parts of the woods, as if there was something there that no one wanted to find. That's what Mark decided to do. What no one else had the courage to do, he would go into the woods himself. He wasn't afraid of stories. He wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of losing his sister forever. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth as Mark grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the tree line. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the crunch of leaves and twigs the only sound he could hear as he walked. He called out her name loud and clear, but the trees swallowed the sound, leaving only the eerie silence in return. He stepped deeper into the woods, pushing his way through the underbrush. The trees seemed to grow thicker as he went, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at him. The air grew colder the further he went, a chill creeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. Mark felt it. Then something was watching him. It wasn't just the trees, it wasn't just the wind, it was something else, something older, something that had always been there, waiting. The silence became oppressive almost, suffocating. The deeper Mark went, the more it felt like the woods were closing in on him, pressing in from all sides, until the sound of his own breathing was the only thing he could hear. then he heard it. Whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. They were faint at first, almost like a breeze brushing through the leaves, but Mark felt them in his chest, in his mind. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words he couldn't understand. Words that didn't belong to any language he knew. "Help me," he whispered to himself, his heart thumping louder in his chest. He called out for Lily again, his voice trembling, but the whispers didn't stop. They were all around him now, swirling, in the air like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And then he saw her, Lily. She was standing in a small clearing ahead, her back to him. Her body was motionless, her dark hair hanging limp around her shoulders. At first, Mark thought she was just standing there, waiting for him to come closer. But as he stepped forward, something felt wrong. Her eyes were wide, empty, like two hollow pits staring out into the nothingness. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, as though she were screaming but could not be heard. Mark felt his heart sink into his stomach. "Lily," he shouted, rushing toward her. But the closer he got, the more distant she seemed. She was still in the clearing just beyond his reach, but her form became hazy, flickering like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the world was still. Too still. Mark reached out, his hand trembling, but before he could touch her, the ground beneath his feet shifted. Trees seemed to groan, their branches twisting unnaturally, reaching for him. He looked around in panic as the earth trembled beneath him. The trees weren't just swaying, they were closing in. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the space around him seemed to shrink, pressing in from all sides. Whispering started. Again, louder this time, but it wasn't just coming from the trees. It was coming from the ground, from the air itself. The voices were no longer unintelligible. They were clear now. "You shouldn't have come," they said in unison, the words like a hiss. Mark felt something cold wrap around his legs. He looked down to see roots thick, black roots emerging from the ground, curling around his ankles, pulling him down. Panic surged in his chest as he tried to break free, but the roots tightened, dragging him further into the earth. Behind him, he heard the soft scraping of bone against bark, the sound of something moving in the shadows. He turned to look, but the clearing was gone. The trees were no longer just trees. They were monstrous, their bark twisted into faces, their limbs reaching out like skeletal hands. And in the distance, he saw her again. Lily. But she was no longer his sister. She had become part of the forest, her form twisted and contorted, her eyes still wide and empty, her mouth still open in a silent scream. The roots pulled harder, dragging him closer to the darkness, and the last thing Mark heard before everything went black was Lily's voice, soft, familiar, yet distant. He should have never come. When they found Mark the next morning, he was lying face down in the clearing, his eyes wide open, but empty like the trees had taken everything from him. His body was stiff, cold, and when they turned him over, his mouth was open in a scream, but no sound came out. The woods remained silent, as if nothing had happened, and no one ever ventured into the Whispering Woods again. The forgotten town, the town of Old Creek, was forgotten by everyone except those who lived there. The small, isolated town sat quietly at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by thick, overgrown trees that seemed to hold the town in a perpetual, comforting embrace. The roads leading to it were barely more than dirt paths, winding through a forest that seemed to stretch forever. It wasn't a place anyone would stumble upon by accident. There were no signs pointing to Old Creek, no mention of it in any of the county records. It wasn't in any history books, and when you asked about it, people either looked at you with confusion or deliberately changed the subject. It wasn't as if the town had a dark past, at least, not one anyone was willing to talk about. No. It was as if it had simply ceased to exist for the outside world, erased from maps and memory, trapped in time like a forgotten relic from a place nobody cared to visit. But Emily was different. A young, ambitious journalist with a thirst for stories that could break the mold. She found an old, yellowed map in a dusty archive tucked away. In the corner of a forgotten library, the map had an X marking the place, a small dot labeled Old Creek. The area around it was filled with scribbles and faint notes, some faded and illegible, but enough for Emily to recognize the possibility of something remarkable. She had to see it for herself. After a few failed attempts to find any trace of the town online, Emily decided to make the journey anyway. Armed with the map and a voice recorder, she set out to uncover whatever mystery Old Creek held. As she followed the road that led her deeper into the wilderness, a sense of unease began to gnaw at her. No other cars passed her. No houses or even signs of civilization appeared. She drove further into the woods, the trees growing thicker, casting shadows that crept across her windshield like dark fingers. It took hours before she finally saw it, a small sign barely visible through the thick foliage. Old Creek, it read, in faded white paint. The town was real. She couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation as she drove into the heart of Old Creek. The houses, though old and weathered, stood tall, their porches sagging under years of neglect. But there was something odd about it. It was too quiet, too still. There were no children playing, no cars in the driveways, no sounds of life at all. The windows were dark, lifeless, like eyes long since closed. Emily parked the car in the middle of the street, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She stepped out of the car, feeling an odd sense of being watched, though she couldn't explain why. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite place, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Her eyes scanned the street. The houses, the trees, the eerie silence, it all seemed too perfect, too untouched, like a place caught in time. But time had forgotten Old Creek. A faint whisper caught her attention, the sound of someone moving. She spun around, but there was nothing. Not a person in sight, not a soul in the street. Curious, she walked toward the nearest house. Its windows were boarded up, but the front door stood ajar. Without thinking, she pushed it open, stepping inside. The smell of decay filled her nostrils, old wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly metallic, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Inside the house was bare, save for a few pieces of furniture covered in thick sheets. A rocking chair in the corner creaked gently, though there was no one there to move it. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and the sound of the wind whistling through cracks in the walls sent a chill up her spine. But it was the stillness that struck her most. It was as if the town had been frozen in place for years, untouched. By time or the outside world, she stepped back out into the street, her heart racing. The town felt wrong, like a dream, too perfect, too silent. Nightfall came quickly, and as the last light of the setting sun slipped behind the trees, something shifted. Emily stood in the middle of the street, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. And then she heard it dash footsteps. She spun around. Figures emerged from the shadows, moving slowly, deliberately. At first she thought they were just townsfolk coming out to greet her. But as they drew closer, she saw their faces, or rather, the lack of them. They were obscured by shadows, their features hidden beneath dark hoods. Their movements were slow, unnaturally so, as though they were part of the very fabric of the town, stitched into the landscape like forgotten ghosts. Emily's pulse quickened as she realized they were approaching her. But what terrified her the most was the feeling of recognition. The sense that these figures weren't strangers, they knew her. One of them stepped forward, its face still hidden, but the voice that came from it was clear. "You're one of us." Now it said, its voice cold, distant. Emily's heart stopped. She backed away slowly, her breath coming in short gasps. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice shaky. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the hood, and though its face remained obscured. Emily felt its gaze pierce through her, as if it could see the very marrow of her bones. "You've always been one of us," the voice said again, its tone final. "You've just never remembered." Before she could react, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving Emily standing alone in the street. She tried to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as though the town itself had wrapped its tendrils around her, trapping her in place. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees in a language she couldn't understand, but one she knew. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and then, as if she had been a part of this forgotten town all along, Emily understood. The town didn't. Just remember you. It claimed you. Old Creek had always been waiting for her, and now it was her turn to stay. The next morning, the town was just as quiet as it had been the night before. The streets were empty, the houses still, but there was something different. Something new. Emily had become part of Old Creek, just like the others before her, and the town hidden away in the valley remained forgotten by everyone except the ones who belonged there. The restless neighborhood all started when the new family moved in next door to Sarah. They came quietly, like a fog rolling in under the cover of night. Fanfare and noisy moving trucks. Just a few cars parked out front, and the unsettling sound of furniture being shifted through thin walls. At first, Sarah thought it was just a coincidence. After all, people moved in and out of the neighborhood all the time. But as the days passed, she noticed something strange. The house next door was always dark at night. Not a single light ever flickered through the windows. And during the day, the kids never played outside. There were no sounds of laughter or running feet on the sidewalk, just the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner or the low murmur of voices from behind drawn curtains. Sarah tried to be friendly. She baked cookies and made the trek next door with a warm plate, the kind of gesture that small-town neighbors did. But when she knocked, no one answered. And when she saw the couple, they always seemed a little off. They were polite, of course, but distant. Their eyes never quite met hers. Their smiles were strained. And there was always an unspoken tension between them. Something wasn't right. And as the days bled into weeks, Sarah's unease grew. Then one night it happened. She had just settled into bed, the silence of the house surrounding her, when she was woken by a soft knock at the door. At first she thought it was a dream, but the knock came again, louder this time. She checked the clock. It was well after midnight. With a sigh, she pulled on her robe and padded down the hallway, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. When she opened the door, the woman from next door was standing on her porch. She looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and her hands trembled at her sides as though they were too weak to support her own weight. "Help. Me," the woman whispered, her voice quivering with a terror Sarah couldn't place. "He's in the house. I don't know what he's become." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" she asked, confused, worried. "What's going on?" The woman took a step forward, her breath shaky. "My husband. He's not my husband anymore. Please, you have to help me." Without thinking, Sarah nodded, her instincts kicking in. "Come inside. Let's talk about this," she said, her voice calming. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she clutched at Sarah's sleeve, her fingers cold and clammy. "Please," she begged again. "I need you to come with me. It's not him. It's something else." Confused and now deeply concerned, Sarah hesitated only a moment before following the woman out into the night. They crossed the lawn to the wall. House next door, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rustling leaves. The front door was wide open, the frame dark and empty. As they stepped inside, Sarah immediately felt a sense of unease. The house was too still, too quiet. There were no sounds of life-known television, no footsteps upstairs, no sign of anyone. It felt wrong. The woman led her through the darkened hallways, her grip on Sarah's arm tightening with every step. As they neared the staircase, Sarah heard it, a faint scraping sound from above, like nails dragging across wood. "The attic," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "That's where he is." Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The scraping grew louder as they climbed the stairs, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The house seemed to close in around them, the walls creaking and groaning with the weight of something ancient. They reached the door at the top of the stairs, an old wooden door, covered in dust, its hinges rusted and stiff. Without warning, the door swung open on its own, as if pushed by an invisible force. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering bulb in the corner. The attic was filled with old, broken furniture, dusty chairs, boxes stacked high with forgotten things. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the man, her husband. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were vacant, his face twisted into a grotesque grin that didn't belong. His skin had a pallor to it that was unnatural, and he was standing unnaturally still, as if waiting for something or someone. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint scraping of his nails against the wooden floor. The same sound Sarah had heard from below. He didn't move, but his eyes, those vacant eyes, shifted to meet hers. They were full of nothing, empty, dead. The woman began to sob uncontrollably. "He's not my husband anymore," she choked out, her voice breaking. "He's something else." Sarah felt a cold weight settle in her chest, like a stone pressing against her ribs. She had seen the man before, the one who had greeted her with polite nods when they first moved in. He had looked so normal, so human. But now he was something else. A thing, a creature. His movements were jerky, his limbs too stiff, and the grin, that twisted, unnatural grin. It stretched wider with every passing second. Suddenly, his head jerked forward with a violent motion, and he took a slow, deliberate step toward them. "Stay away!" The woman screamed, but her voice was drowned by the growl that escaped the man's throat deep. Guttural, like an animal trapped in its own skin. It wasn't him anymore. It couldn't be. Whatever he was, whatever he had become, he was hungry. Hungry for something more than the life he had once had. The woman tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to run. The thing took another step forward. His smile grew impossibly wide, and his eyes locked onto Sarah's. She tried to move, but her body was frozen, rooted to the spot by a wave of pure terror. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from the deepest, darkest part of the room, he whispered, "She's mine now." Before she could scream, the world went black the next morning. Sarah was found standing at the edge of the driveway, staring at the house. Her eyes were wide open, but empty. Like the woman's husband's, she was standing perfectly still, just her arms hanging by her sides and a twisted grin stretched across her face. The neighbors would say later that there was something off about her smile, something wrong. And as for the woman, she was never seen again. But some say she's still out there, waiting in the shadows of the old house on the hill, where the scraping sounds echo through the night. The man is still there too. The old man on the bridge every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, an old man could be seen sitting on the bridge that spanned the river in Greystone Valley. He was a fixture, a silent sentinel. His back bent with age and his face weathered by years of hard living. He never spoke to anyone, never interacted with the people who passed by, who walked along the river, across the bridge on their way home. He just sat there, still as a statue, staring out into the water as though it held the answers to some question he'd long since stopped asking at first. People thought he was just a harmless recluse, someone who had long ago given up on the world and found peace in his solitude. Greystone Valley was a small, sleepy town, and the old man was nothing more than another quirky character in a place full of them. But then, strange things started happening. People began disappearing. It started with a couple of drifters who had wandered into town, the kind of people who came through with no particular destination, only to fade into the background, forgotten after a few weeks. They never came back. Then, it was the farmers, the ones who lived on the outskirts of town. First one, then another. Each disappearance was more puzzling than the last. No clues, no signs of struggle. Just empty homes, and the faint, lingering sense that something dark had passed through the valley. The townsfolk began to whisper, their voices low, cautious. They spoke of the old man, about how he had been sitting on that bridge for as long as anyone could remember, and how the disappearances had coincided with his presence. There was something about him, something unsettling. He never seemed to. Age, his face always the same weathered mask, his movements slow but deliberate. He was always there, watching the river as though it held secrets only he understood. Bobby Rivers. A young investigative reporter had heard the stories long before he moved to Greystone Valley. He'd come to the town seeking a quiet place too, escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But the stories intrigued him. Whispers of a curse, strange disappearances, and an old man who never seemed to age. They were too good to ignore. He couldn't resist. He decided to uncover the truth. It didn't take long for Bobby to realize there was something deeply wrong in Greystone Valley. The people were kind, but distant. They seemed to avoid talking about the disappearances, and when Bobby asked questions, they gave him evasive answers, their eyes darting nervously. It was clear that no one wanted to discuss the old man on the bridge, or the strange things that had happened ever since he'd come to town. One evening, just as the shadows began to stretch across the valley, Bobby decided to confront the old man. He couldn't shake the feeling that the key to the disappearances was right there. In front of him, sitting on that bridge, staring into the water. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the bridge, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick with the smell of the river and the rustling of leaves, but it felt wrong, like the world had tilted slightly, and Bobby was. Walking just a little out of sync with reality, the old man was there, as he always was. Sitting on the edge of the bridge, hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the river below. Bobby stood a few feet away, hesitant but determined. He cleared his throat. "What do you want?" Bobby asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. To remain calm, the old man's head turned slowly, and when his eyes met Bobby's, something in them made Bobby freeze. They were ancient in a way that shouldn't have been possible. They were the eyes of someone who had seen and known things no one should know. Someone who had watched the world unravel and had simply waited. There was a knowing in those eyes, something far too old, far too deep. It was as though the old man had been around long before Bobby had ever stepped foot in this town, and would be here long after Bobby was gone. "What do I want?" The old man's voice was a rasp, like dry leaves scraping against the ground. "Want you to stay?" Bobby's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy, the unspoken meaning clear. The old man wasn't asking Bobby to stay. He was telling him. Bobby realized, with a growing horror, that it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. Bobby opened his mouth to speak, to ask what the old man meant, but before he could, a cold gust of wind blew through the trees, making him shiver. The river below them began to ripple, the surface disturbed by something unseen, something waiting beneath. The sound of the water, normally soothing, now felt like a slow, endless drumbeat, something ominous. "You shouldn't have come," old man said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You never should have come." Bobby's breath caught in his throat, and his hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He tried to step back, but his legs felt like lead, heavy and immobile. The old man's eyes never left him, and the world around Bobby seemed to warp. The sounds of the river and the wind growing louder and more frantic. Suddenly, Bobby felt it, a pull, like something invisible was tugging at his chest, drawing him closer to the old man, to the edge of the bridge. His heart raced in his chest as the force grew stronger, tightening around him like an unbreakable grip. The old man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he were a creature of the night, a force that had been waiting for centuries. He reached out, a skeletal hand extending toward Bobby. And for the first time, Bobby saw the true nature of the old man's face, a twisted, hollow mask of age, with cracks running through it like the surface of a dry riverbed. Bobby tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. And then, the world went dark. The next morning, the townsfolk found Bobby. He was lying by the riverbank, his body twisted unnaturally, his eyes wide open and empty, staring out into the water. His expression was blank, his face pale, as though he had seen something beyond the living. And in the depths of his gaze, there was a haunting emptiness, as though the old man on the bridge had reached into his very soul and claimed it for himself. The river flowed quietly, as it always did, and the old man, he was gone, as if he had never been there at all. But the legend of the old man on the bridge lived on, and those who had the courage to speak of it knew the truth. The old man wasn't just a part of Greystone Valley's past. He was the bridge between the living and the dead. And if you stood too close for too long, you might just find yourself crossing it. The last ride every town had its local legend. And in Miller's Bay, it was the Ferris wheel, a rusted old carnival ride that hadn't moved in years. It stood like a skeleton at the edge of the fairgrounds, creaking in the wind, forgotten. The old carnival had been shut down when Danny was still a kid, but the Ferris wheel? That was something else. People in town said it was haunted, that it still worked on its own, spinning in the dead of night when the moon was high. And if you dared ride it, you'd never come back. Danny never believed in that kind of stuff. He wasn't a superstitious guy, not at all. He was a thrill seeker, always chasing a good scare. So when Halloween night rolled around, he and a few of his friends decided to spend it at the long-abandoned carnival. They had heard the stories, of course, but Danny just laughed them off. Ghosts? Haunted rides? Ridiculous? All they needed was the thrill of sneaking into the old fairgrounds and proving everyone wrong. It wasn't hard to break in. The gates were rusted, the locks long since busted. As the group snuck through the broken fences, they laughed and joked, the sound of their voices swallowed by the cold wind that howled across the grounds. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a sickly glow over the place, illuminating the decaying remnants of the once thriving carnival. They made their way straight for the Ferris wheel. The massive metal structure loomed over them, its rusted cars swaying eerily in the breeze. The paint was peeling, the seats torn, but to Danny, this was just a Redan, old rickety thing that had stood the test of time. Or so he thought. "Let's do it," Danny said, grinning at his friends. They had dared each other to climb in, each of them secretly hoping to outdo the others. They weren't scared, or so they told themselves. The Ferris wheel creaked as Danny climbed into one of the seats. His friends stood below, watching with laughter in their eyes, ready to prove there's nothing to this legend, Danny. One of them called out, "Danny?" Didn't answer, just settled into the seat, pushing back against the rusted metal and watching the others. His friends had dared him to ride it, and he was more than willing to show them it was all just nonsense. He tugged the seatbelt across his lap and gave the wheel a push, just for kicks. But as soon as his feet left the ground, something strange happened. It began to move, slowly at first, with a groan of old gears and the rattle of chains. But then, to Danny's surprise, it picked up speed faster than it should have, faster than it ever had before. The wheel spun, creaking and groaning, its metal arms shaking like a beast, awakening from a long slumber. The night air whipped around him as the ground below grew distant. His friends' voices became muffled, swallowed by the wind and the creak of the wheel as it climbed higher and higher. Danny's excitement quickly shifted to unease. The faster the wheel spun, the less in control he felt. He gripped the seat tightly, but it didn't help. The ride kept going, and his heart started pounding. "Hey!" Danny shouted down at his friends, but they were too far below to hear him, their faces lost in the distance. What the hell is going on? But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the Ferris wheel stopped. The brakes screeched with a noise, so loud it nearly deafened him, and for a moment everything was still. He exhaled, relieved that the ride was over, but when he looked around, something was terribly wrong. The town below him, the town he had known all his life, wasn't there anymore. Instead of the quiet, sleepy streets of Miller's Bay, there was a twisted version of it, a version that was wrong in ways he couldn't immediately understand. The houses were misshapen, their windows broken and gaping like empty eyes. The streetlights flickered with an unnatural flickering glow. There, in the distance, just at the edge of his vision, were figures, dark shapes, standing still in the shadows, watching him. Danny's heart began to race. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying to make sense of the scene before him. The fog that had once been harmless now hung thick in the air, swirling around him, making everything feel alien and strange. The Ferris wheel groaned again, the seat he was sitting in swaying gently. He pulled at the harness, but it was locked tight. He tried to call down to his friends, but there was no answer. His voice didn't carry. It was as though the town below him had been completely swallowed by some strange force. Then the figures moved, slowly at first. They shambled toward him, their dark forms stretching unnaturally. Their faces, if you could call them, faces were blank, empty, like something that had been worn smooth by time. They were all staring at him, Danny's stomach twisted in fear. The figures were getting closer. He could hear their footsteps now, a slow, steady thud that echoed in the thick, suffocating air. He tried to scream, but the sound got stuck in his throat, choked off by the cold, thick atmosphere. He could feel something closing in, suffocating him, and he had never felt more alone in his life. Suddenly, the Ferris wheel jerked to life again, spinning wildly, faster than before. Danny gripped the metal seat, but it was no use. He was being dragged through the air, helpless, as the figures below him stretched and twisted, growing taller, reaching up, reaching for him. "You shouldn't have come," one of the figures called. Out, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. Distorted by the wind, the Ferris wheel spun faster and faster. And as the shadows closed in, Danny saw them for what they truly were. They weren't people. They were things. And they were waiting for him. The wheel continued to spin, dragging Danny higher and higher into the darkened sky, until all that remained was the sound of his heartbeat, racing in his chest, and the laughter of the Ferris wheel, louder and louder, till it drowned everything else out. And that was the last ride Danny would ever take. The Ferris wheel didn't stop spinning. Not that night. Not ever again. The child in the mirror, Sarah, had always taken pride in the large, antique mirror that had been passed down through generations of her family. It hung in the living room, reflecting the soft light from the lamps and the occasional flicker of the television. Her grandmother had always spoken about the mirror as though it were more than just a piece of furniture, a family heirloom that held secrets. A window to the past. But to Sarah, it was just an old, ornate mirror. Something she was happy to inherit as a reminder of her grandmother. She didn't think much of it. At first, it wasn't until one rainy evening that Sarah began to notice something strange. She had been reading on the couch, the rain tapping softly against the windows, when she glanced up at the mirror. For just a moment, in the reflection, she thought she saw something, a small figure standing in the corner of the room just behind her. At first, she chalked it up to a trick of the light, a shadow that played tricks on her tired eyes. But over the next few nights, the figure appeared again. And again, the child, a small girl, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through Sarah. She was always standing in the corner of the room, near the chair where Sarah usually sat. Her face was ghostly, her mouth slightly open, as if she were about to speak, but was waiting for the right moment. Sarah tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was simply a trick of the light, a flaw in the glass. Maybe it was just a shadow, cast by the angle of the room. But the child's reflection remained clear and unmistakable. Every time Sarah glanced at the mirror, the little girl would be there, standing motionless, her gaze fixed firmly on Sarah. The unease grew, gnawing at the back of Sarah's mind. But she couldn't bring herself to confront it. Every time she looked away, the child would vanish from the reflection, only to return when Sarah wasn't paying attention. But the next time she caught sight of the girl, something was different. The child wasn't just standing there. She was closer. She was now standing near the center of the mirror, her pale face pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes locked onto Sarah's with an unsettling intensity. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The girl's eyes were wide, her expression almost pleading, as if she were trying to communicate something Sarah couldn't understand. That night, unable to take it anymore, Sarah rose from the couch. She walked slowly toward the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out, her fingers brushed the surface of the glass. The moment her fingers touched the mirror, everything changed. The child's eyes locked onto hers, and in an instant, the air in the room grew cold, chilling Sarah to the bone. It felt as if something in the room had shifted, as if the mirror were no longer a reflection but a doorway to something far darker. Before Sarah could pull her hand away, a cold grip wrapped around her wrist, tightening painfully. She gasped, her heart racing as the pressure intensified. Her fingers, still touching the mirror, felt like they were being drawn into it, as if the glass was softening under her touch. A voice, soft and raspy, whispered from the other side of the mirror, echoing in the room. "He's here." The grip on. Her wrists tightened, and Sarah cried out, trying to pull her hand free. But the more she struggled, the stronger the force became, dragging her closer to the mirror. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around her. The child's face in the reflection twisted into a grin, a knowing, a malicious smile that sent a chill through Sarah's entire body. With one final, desperate jerk, Sarah tore her hand away from the mirror. She stumbled back, her chest heaving as the grip loosened, and the room returned to normal. The child's figure was gone from the glass. The mirror was silent once more, but Sarah could still feel the cold, icy touch on her skin. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find the mirror cracked. A jagged line ran through the center, splitting the reflection down the middle. The child remained. In the reflection, she stood in the same spot as always near the corner of the room. But now, her eyes were wide and empty, her grin twisted and grotesque. As though she were mocking Sarah, her gaze seemed to pierce through the cracks in the glass. It felt as though the child was still waiting for her to come closer. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as she stood there, rooted to the spot. The chill that had taken over her the night before had not left. In fact, it had only deepened. Something had crossed over that night. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was a connection to something else, something dark. The child was still there waiting, and Sarah knew deep down that the mirror was calling to her. It was calling her to come closer, to join the child on the other side. And Sarah knew, with a sickening certainty, she couldn't stay away forever. But she wasn't ready, not yet. She turned away, walking slowly out of the room, trying to ignore the feeling that the child's hollow eyes were following her every move, waiting for the day when she would return. But the child was patient, and the mirror, like the child, would wait. The forgotten child, the house on Willow Lane, had been abandoned for decades. Its dilapidated frame loomed over the town like a specter, dark and foreboding, casting a long shadow over the once beautiful street. To the locals, it was a place steeped in mystery, a house best left untouched. Whispers about the family who had lived there had passed through the town like rumors of a fevered dream. The family had vanished without a trace. Their daughter, Evelyn, lost to time in a lingering darkness no one dared speak of aloud. The house, with its boarded-up windows and decaying facade, stood as a tomb for their secrets. No one knew exactly what had happened to the family. Some said they left in the dead of night, fleeing a tragedy too terrible to understand. Others swore they had simply disappeared, swallowed up by the earth beneath their feet. But the most chilling story was the one about the little girl, Evelyn, who had never been found, whose voice had been heard in the distance, was calling for help, just before the house fell silent forever. As the years passed, the house was avoided. The children in town dared not wander too close, and the adults simply shook their heads when asked about it. The history of Willow Lane's forgotten house was woven into the fabric of the town itself, its mysteries as thick as the ivy that crept up the walls. But, as with all things buried, there are always those who dare to unearth what's better left undisturbed. One stormy evening, a group of teenagers stood in front of the house. Their faces were half lit by the flickering light of a flashlight, their breath visible in the cold air. They were on a dare nothing more than a childish whim. The rain beat down on the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, but their laughter was louder. For them, the house was nothing more than a challenge. "Bet you won't go in," Tommy taunted, his voice shaky but trying to sound confident. "Watch." "Me," came the defiant reply from Laura, who pushed past him and reached for the rusted doorknob. It creaked as it turned, the sound enough to make the group flinch. The door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing the dark hallway inside. They stepped into the house, their shoes squeaking on the dust-covered floorboards. The air inside was thick with the musty scent of old wood and forgotten things. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the dim light from their flashlights flickered. As they shone on peeling wallpaper and crumbling furniture, the silence inside was heavy, oppressive, It was as though the house itself was waiting for something. The teenagers made their way through the downstairs rooms, their footsteps echoing in the hollow emptiness. They dared each other to touch the old furniture, to explore the faded remnants of a life that had been abandoned so long ago. But as they ventured further into the house, the atmosphere grew thicker. The weight of the place, pressing down on them like a storm, was ready to break. It was when they reached the upstairs hallway that things began to feel ... wrong. "Look at this," Mark said, pointing to a faded tapestry hanging on the wall. It was torn at the edges, fraying with age, but it still hung there. Hiding a door behind it, the group exchanged uneasy glances. Laura asked, her voice barely a whisper, without waiting for an answer.
Out?
Tommy yanked the tapestry down, revealing a small hidden door. It wasn't large, just a narrow doorway leading up into the attic. The air around them grew colder, and a strange feeling settled over them. "Let's go up," Mark urged, trying to sound brave, with hesitation in their steps. The group climbed the narrow stairs, their flashlights casting eerie shadows along the walls. The attic was dark, filled with the remnants of a forgotten life-fold furniture covered in dusty sheets, broken mirrors, boxes that had long since been emptied of their contents. And then they saw it. An old rocking chair sat in the center of the room, its wooden arms worn from years of use. A teddy bear, its fur faded and threadbare, sat slumped in the chair, staring up at them with unblinking glass eyes. The floor was littered with old, discarded items, a picture frame, an empty toy chest, and something that seemed to call out to them, something they couldn't quite name, but it was the picture frame that caught their attention. It was cracked, the glass dull and scratched, but there was something about it that made them pause. As they picked it up, they saw the face of a little girl pale, with wide, vacant eyes. Her expression was frozen in an eternal gaze, as if she were staring directly at them. And then, the door slammed shut behind them. The room grew colder. A heavy silence fell over the group. No one spoke, but each one of them felt it, the creeping unease that filled the air like a thick fog. They turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had sealed them inside, and then they heard it. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible. A child's laugh, soft and distant, like a memory slipping through their fingers. But then it grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling the room with a sound that was both joyful and terrifying. The laughter seemed to come from nowhere, wrapping around them like a dark, invisible presence. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. "What the hell is that?" She gasped, her voice shaking. The others were frozen, staring at the rocking chair. The teddy bear, once motionless, had shifted. It was now sitting upright, as though someone had placed it there. The rocking chair creaked, moving slightly, as if being rocked by an unseen hand. And then the laughter stopped. Silence followed that was more terrifying than the noise itself. The girl in the picture seemed to smile, her eyes deepening, growing darker. And just as the silence began to feel unbearable, a voice filled the air, soft but unmistakable. It was the voice of the little girl, the one from the picture, in the darkness. The door to the attic clicked open. The teenagers didn't need to say a word. They ran stumbling over each other as they barreled down the stairs, their breath ragged. In their chests, the laughter followed them, growing louder, echoing through the house as if it were alive, urging them forward. By the time they made it outside, the storm had passed. The feeling of the house lingered in the air like a heavy fog. They never spoke of what happened that night, but none of them returned to Willow Lane. None of them dared to approach the house again. But the whispers about Evelyn and the forgotten child didn't stop. It never stopped, and the house on Willow Lane remained, waiting for the next ones to come. The Collerate was a quiet evening when Laura picked up the phone. The kind of evening where the only sounds in the house were the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the soft hum of the refrigerator. She hadn't been expecting a call, but when the phone rang, she answered it out of habit. The voice on the other end was soft, it was almost soothing. But there was something strange about it, something familiar, but she couldn't place it. "I'm still here," the voice said. Laura paused, her heart skipping a beat. She frowned, a chill creeping up her spine. Wrong number, she thought. People got the wrong number all the time. It was nothing. But why did the voice sound so... familiar? She shook the thought from her head. Sorry, she said. I think you've got the wrong number. But the voice didn't respond. Instead, it repeated the same message. I'm still here. A pause. Then in the same eerie, calm voice it added, I'm waiting. Laura's pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just some random wrong number. The voice. The voice was too familiar, too insistent. She held the phone tighter, staring at the receiver as though it might tell her who was on the other end. Who is this? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, but the line went dead before she could get an answer. Laura stood there for a moment, holding the phone in her hand, her mind racing. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe it was someone from her past. Some old friend or acquaintance. Messing with her. She didn't know. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She shook her head. Get a grip, Laura, she muttered to herself. It's nothing. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The next night, when the phone rang again, Laura hesitated. Had been quiet all day, the house still and peaceful, and the sound of the ringing phone seemed almost out of place in the silence. She picked it up reluctantly. I'm still here. It was the same voice. Soft, calm, but now laced with something else, something that made Laura's skin crawl. Laura's fingers tightened around the receiver, her heart pounding. She couldn't speak, couldn't form a word. It was like the voice had a grip on her, throat suffocating her. The voice repeated the words, but this time there was a shift, a hint of recognition in its tone. I'm still here, it said again, and I remember you. Laura's breath hitched. What do you want? She whispered, her voice barely audible, but the voice didn't answer. It simply repeated, once again, I'm still here? The line clicked. Silenced, Laura stared at the phone for a long time, the receiver still in her trembling hand. She couldn't understand what was happening. Why was this person calling her, and why did they sound so familiar? The third night, the call came at the same time. Laura didn't even need to look at the phone. She knew who it was. The voice. She felt it in her bones, the icy fear creeping over her like a cold wave. I'm still here. It was like the voice had been waiting for her to answer. She could hear it now. There was something wrong in its tone. Something deeper than just a strange wrong number. It felt ... personal. I know you, the voice said. Laura's breath caught in her throat. Who is this? She demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. Why are you doing this? Pause. And then the voice spoke again. Its calmness made the words all the more unsettling. I know where you are. Laura's blood ran cold. She felt her heart stop for a moment, her chest tightening. What do you want? She cried. Who are you? The voice was silent for a long time, then spoke softly, almost as though it were whispering right next to her ear. I'm in the house. Words sliced through the silence, sending a jolt of terror straight to Laura's core. She spun around, her eyes wide with panic. The house was still. There was no sound except the pounding of her own heartbeat. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something or someone was watching her, waiting for her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the phone tighter. She whispered to herself, no, it's just a prank. It's nothing, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was in the house. She put the phone down slowly, every nerve in her body screaming for her to do something. She couldn't stay here. She needed to get out, to call the police, to do something. But when she reached for the door, her hand stopped. Her fingers hovered over the knob, and for a moment she simply stood there, listening. The house was silent, too silent. Her mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. The door was locked. No one could have entered without her knowing. And yet the words still echoed in her head. I'm in the house. Suddenly, she heard it, a soft, creaking sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone or something moving on the floor above her, slowly, deliberately, and then a whisper. Laura. breath caught in her throat. The voice was back. But this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from inside the house. She turned around, heart hammering in her chest, and the darkness of the hallway loomed ahead. It felt like the walls were closing in, shadows wrapping around her, suffocating her. And somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the voice. That voice, I'm still here. And this time it wasn't leaving. The harvesting season Maple Grove was always quiet, a picturesque town nestled in the heart of the countryside, where autumn painted the trees in rich hues of gold and crimson. The streets were lined with old cobblestone houses and small family-owned shops. On the surface, it looked like the ideal place to live, peaceful, serene, untouched by time. But every fall, as the crisp breeze swept in and the leaves began to fall, something else crept into the town, a sense of unease. The Harvest Festival was Maple Grove's most cherished event. Every year, families gathered in the town square. Children ran through the streets with baskets of pumpkins, and the scent of roasted apples and cinnamon filled the air. The townsfolk would celebrate the bounty of the earth, a celebration of the crops that had been carefully tended and harvested throughout the season. For months, they prepared. But for some, the excitement of the festival was tinged with an undercurrent of dread, as if they were celebrating something far darker than the harvest itself. Leah had moved to Maple Grove just a few months ago. She was a newcomer, eager to make friends and immerse herself in the town's way of life. She had heard of the Harvest Festival, of course. It was legendary, a time when the town came alive. And when she was invited by the friendly old woman down the street to help with the festival preparations, Leah was excited. It would be a perfect opportunity to meet more people and learn about the traditions that made the town so special. She arrived early on the morning of the festival, walking through the golden fields just outside town with a group of locals. There was an air of cheerfulness among them, but as Leah looked around, something seemed off. The fields, usually brimming with crops this time of year, were bare. There wasn't a stalk of corn or a pumpkin in sight. The earth itself seemed dry, cracked, lifeless. The soil was a dull brown, void of any vegetation. She hesitated, glancing around. "Where are the crops?" she asked, her voice tentative. One of the women, a kind but weathered-looking woman with a wide smile, looked at her and laughed. "Oh, don't worry about that. There's nothing to harvest this year." Leah frowned. The woman's cheerful tone made her think she was just misunderstanding something. After all, the Harvest Festival had always been about celebrating the bounty of the land, didn't it? The lack of crops should have been concerning, but the others seemed so carefree, so Leah let it go. For now, as the sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty fields, a strange smell began to fill the air. It was faint at first, like a sourness that clung to the edges of the breeze. But as the minutes passed, it grew stronger, turning the air thick with the scent of something rotten, something decayed. Leah's stomach twisted. She couldn't place it at first, but the odor reminded her of something. It's like spoiled meat, or worse. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the town into twilight, the townspeople began gathering in the center of the town square. They were dressed in their finest clothes. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, almost like they were in a trance. They greeted each other warmly, but their eyes were cold, distant, as if they were watching, something just beyond Leah's reach. Leah walked toward the crowd, her curiosity getting the better of her. She was expecting music, dancing, and games, as one would expect at a harvest celebration. But as she neared the center, her heart began to race. The people were standing in a large circle, and in the middle of the circle, there was something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't a pile of crops. It wasn't the bounty of the earth. What the townspeople were preparing for was something far darker. Leah's eyes widened in horror as she saw it. Flesh. Human flesh. Piles of its skin, muscle, and bone piled high in the center of the square. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and it wasn't just the smell that made Leah's stomach churn. It was the sight of it. The flesh wasn't raw, not exactly. It was grown in a way that was unnatural. It had the consistency of something that had been carefully cultivated. Tended to over time, the townspeople weren't celebrating the harvest of the land. They were celebrating something far more grotesque, and as Leah watched, horrified and frozen in place, she realized with growing dread that the flesh wasn't just an offering. It was the crop. The people of Maple Grove didn't harvest crops from the earth. They harvested from themselves. The townsfolk were watching her now, their eyes locked onto hers, and it was as if the air had thickened, the circle closing in around her. Leah tried to move, but her legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by invisible chains. She took a step back, then another, but the people weren't letting her go. They were waiting for her. Leah, a voice came from behind her. Was the old woman who had invited her earlier, her smile twisted in a way that no longer seemed friendly. You've been so kind to help with the festival. You're part of the harvest now. I've been waiting for you. Leah's heart pounded as she turned, her breath quickening. The woman stepped forward, her hand reaching out to Leah's arm, her fingers cold and unfeeling. No, you're next, she whispered. The words didn't make sense at first, but then Leah saw it behind the townspeople, behind the rotting flesh. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and hulking, its face obscured by a hood, but its eyes, they glowed with an unnatural light. The townspeople parted to let it through, and Leah realized, with a sickening jolt, that this was no harvest festival. It was a sacrifice. The figure in the cloak reached toward her, and Leah screamed, but it was too late. The people of Maple Grove were already closing in, their hands outstretched, ready to claim her as the final crop of the season. And as she was pulled toward them, Leah understood the true horror of the harvesting season. The earth in Maple Grove didn't yield fruits or vegetables. It yielded human flesh, and she was going to be part of it. The unseen passenger Dan had always hated the long drive down Route 79, especially at night. The road stretched endlessly through the dense woods, twisting and turning like a dark, tangled serpent. The headlights cut through the thick fog, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't seem to illuminate much beyond the stretch of asphalt just ahead. It was the kind of road that made you feel like you were driving into nowhere, no destination except the one you'd rather forget. He'd been driving for hours, the clock ticking away in the quiet of the car and the world outside a blur of shadow and mist. The road was deserted just the way Dan liked it. No cars, no distractions, just him and the road. But tonight, something felt different. There was an odd sensation in the air, something he couldn't quite place. The car, normally light and responsive, seemed heavier, like something was pressing down on it. The silence around him felt oppressive, as if the night itself had grown thick with expectation. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him, and then it happened. A cold draft brushed against the back of his neck. Dan froze. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced quickly to his right, expecting to see the window slightly cracked open, but it wasn't. The air conditioning was off. There was no draft. He turned his head to the back seat, half expecting to see the fog. Windows clear and reveal a figure, someone standing there. But there was no one. The road was still empty. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. Maybe he was just tired. It had been a long drive, but the feeling didn't go away. The air inside. The car grew colder. He shivered, rubbing his arms to ward off the chill that now wrapped around him like a cold blanket. The fog outside thickened, swirling in the headlights, making it harder to see what lay ahead. Dan's eyes flicked nervously between the rear view mirror and the road. Something was off. Couldn't explain it, but every instinct told him that he wasn't alone. Not just in the car, there was something more. Something hidden just beyond his perception. Pressing in on him from all sides, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw it. A figure, pale face, with hollow eyes, sitting. In the back seat, Dan's heart slammed against his chest. His breath hitched. He couldn't move. His fingers tightened around the wheel as if trying to anchor himself to reality. The figure was still. It was staring directly at him, its face a ghastly mask of nothingness without thinking. Dan slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the road. He spun around, eyes wide, mouth dry. back seat was empty. There was no one there. The car jerked forward as the brakes released. Dan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His heart was racing now, pounding in his ears. He could feel the cold creeping in around him like the very air had grown hostile, but he couldn't stop driving. The road stretched ahead, endless and lonely. He had to keep going. Still, the feeling remained. The air was thick with it. The sense that something was there, something watching, waiting. Dan pushed his foot harder on the gas, willing the car to speed up, wanting to get out of whatever was pulling at him. But as he glanced back at the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. The figure was there again, just like before. Pale face, hollow eyes. It was sitting behind him, perfectly still. He could feel it now, creeping closer, like the figure was pushing. In from the edges of his vision, shifting and moving. He was growing, getting nearer. The fog in the mirror seemed to thin around it, and that was when he saw E.T. was closer than before. His breathing was shallow, and the sound of his own. Heartbeat filled his ears, drowning out everything else. The figure grew larger in the mirror, its face filling the small window of reflection. But when he turned around, the seat was empty. Dan's hands were shaking now. His fingers were numb against the wheel. He could feel the presence beside him. Just out of the corner of his eye, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing moment, and then the whisper came. "You should have never picked me up." Dan's blood ran cold. The voice was a low rasp, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't. Coming from the back seat, wasn't coming from anywhere he could see. It was inside his head. He jerked his eyes to the rearview mirror again. This time, the figure wasn't just in the mirror. It was right there, sitting beside him, so close that he could feel its coldness seeping into his skin. The face was now inches from his own, the hollow eyes staring, unblinking, empty. Of anything human, its twisted smile was a grotesque parody of a grin, stretching wide across its face. "You should have never picked me up," it repeated. Its voice a slithering hiss that wrapped itself around Dan's chest like a tightening vice. His breath hitched. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. His hands went numb from gripping the wheel so tightly. The car swerved, barely missing the guardrail as Dan fought to keep control. But the thing beside him, the thing in the seat, was getting closer. It was pushing itself into his space, filling the car with its presence, its cold, sickening presence. Don could hear its breath, wet and ragged in his ear. Then, just as, suddenly, as it had appeared, the thing was gone. The car swerved again, and this time, Dan didn't fight it. The world blurred around him. He could hear the screech of the tires against the wet pavement. The fog was thickening, swirling, pulling him deeper into the blackness. And as his vision went black, the last thing he heard was that laugh, though. Hollow, empty laugh of the thing that had been sitting beside him. The laugh that would echo in his mind forever. When the morning light finally broke through the fog, Route 79 was silent. The road was empty. The car had crashed, its headlights still on, cutting through the mist like ghosts. Sign of Dan, the only thing left was the laughter and the cold. The laughing man-thee neighborhood was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. A place where families grew old together and children played in the streets. It's a kind of place where you could leave your door unlocked and not worry about a thing. The kind of place where, on a warm summer evening, you could sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun set without a care in the world. But there was something wrong with the house at the end of the block. It wasn't an isoret, wasn't even abandoned. In fact, Mr. Grayson kept it up well enough. The lawn was trimmed, the paint on the shutters was fresh, and the windows gleamed in the daylight. But at night it became a different place. People stayed away, not out of malice, but out of fear. You see, Mr. Grayson wasn't a bad man. At least that's what the neighbors said. He didn't drink. Didn't cause trouble. He was just ... strange. The house was always quiet during the day. But come nightfall, there was something else, the laughter. It started as a low chuckle. Then, over time, it grew. It echoed through the street at odd hours, when everyone else was asleep, when the town had settled into its nighttime rhythm. It wasn't the kind of laugh you would expect from a man enjoying a funny thought. No, this laugh was hollow, empty. It crawled under your skin and gnawed at your nerves, like someone was laughing at a joke only they understood a joke that didn't make sense. The laughter would rise and fall, sometimes shrill and sharp. Other times slow and drawn out, like it was coming from deep within the house itself. And always when it sounded, the windows of Mr. Grayson's house would be dark, his silhouette nowhere to be seen. That's when Sarah moved into the neighborhood. She was new, curious. She had heard the whispers about the laughing man, but she wasn't one to scare easily. After all, she'd grown up in a small town herself, and every town had its oddities. A man who laughed at night? Well, that was just another quirk of life. Maybe it was something to do with his old age. Maybe it was just ... loneliness. So one evening, when the laugh echoed through the streets again, Sarah decided to find out. She'd been meaning to introduce herself to Mr. Grayson anyway. Couldn't hurt, right? Her fingers trembled slightly as she knocked on the door. The sound of her knuckles tapping against the wood felt strange, almost surreal in the quiet. Night. The laughter continued from inside, but it was softer now, like a murmur, as if it were just around the corner. Sarah waited, listening. There was no answer. "Mr. Grayson?" she called out, her voice breaking the silence. Nothing. She hesitated. But only for a second. Then she turned the knob. The door creaked loudly as it swung open. The sound cut through the air, sending a shiver down her spine. She stepped inside, her footfalls muffled by the thick carpet. The house was darker than she had expected, filled with shadows that seemed to cling to the walls like they were alive. "Mr. Grayson," she called again, her voice now trembling with a mixture of curiosity and unease. No response, but the laughter, it was still there, faint but undeniable. The sound came from deeper within the house, an eerie guttural laugh that rattled. Her bones, Sarah felt a chill, one that had nothing to do with the cool night air. She stood there, frozen for a moment, listening to the laugh echo down the hallway. Something inside her told her to turn around and leave, to shut the door and pretend she never heard it. But something else, something darker, drove her forward. She stepped deeper into the house, the floor creaking under her weight, as if the house itself was groaning in protest. She followed the laughter, moving through the dark hallway until she reached a small room at the back of the house. There, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, was Mr. Grayson. His face was obscured by shadows, but Sarah could see his eyes glazed over, unblinking. A twisted smile tugged at his lips, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was something darker, something wrong. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. The laughter grew louder, filling the room until Sarah felt like she might suffocate from it. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw the deep, hollow emptiness in them. His smile stretched impossibly wide, and then it stopped. The house fell silent, and for a long moment, Sarah thought she had imagined the whole thing. But then he spoke again. "I've been waiting for someone to join me in the dark." His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it pierced her like a knife. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands went cold. She took a step back, but her feet felt heavy, stuck to the floor. Ow! The silence was unbearable now, suffocating, and it was then that she saw it. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like charcoal. Some of them were familiar, twisted, but others, they were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, and her stomach churned with nausea. And then, in the far corner of the room, a black shadow moved. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but then it shifted again, slowly, deliberately, and she said it was alive. A low whisper filled the room, the sound seeping into Sarah's ears, and her name was spoken softly, but unmistakably Sarah. The shadow stretched toward her, its form undulating like smoke, but with the weight of something solid. It reached for her with long, dark tendrils, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't move. Mr. Grayson chuckled again, his laughter like nails scraping against stone. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. The shadows swirled around her, and then everything went black. The next morning, the house stood still, as it always had. The laughter had stopped, and the door was shut tight. No one saw Sarah again, and though the house was the same as it had ever been, the neighbors knew something had changed. They said that sometimes, late at night, if you listened closely, you could hear two things: a laugh and a voice, Sarah's voice, whispering, ever so faintly, from behind the walls. The window on the second floor, Briar's Hollow, was a town buried in the folds of time, a place forgotten by most, but never by the locals who still remembered the shadows that lingered in the corners of the old mansion on the hill. The mansion had stood for as long as anyone could remember, its windows always locked tight, its doors creaking with the wind. The house looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but it wasn't the decay that bothered the people of Briar's Hollow. It was the window on the second floor. The window was always there, a dark square of emptiness, framed by rotting shutters. And in the quiet of the night, sometimes the locals swore they saw something, or someone behind it. Some said it was a shadow, moving slowly, a form watching, waiting. Others whispered of a figure, a man, a woman, always standing still. Their faces never visible, their movements never clear. But whatever it was, the eyes of Briar's Hollow were always drawn to that second floor window. But the whispers surrounding the mansion were not just about what was seen. They told of James and Clara, a young couple who had moved into the mansion years ago. At first, they were like any other couple, dreaming of a life together, hoping for peace in the quiet town. But the people who saw them last said they had changed. Their faces became hollow, their eyes dark. The glow of their once beaming love had disappeared. Then, one night, they disappeared, vanished without a trace. All that was left was a note, found on the kitchen table, hastily written in a shaking hand. "Don't open the window." The note was all anyone had left. The house was abandoned once again. But the window, the second floor window, remained. Locked and unyielding, like a secret buried deep within the mansion's walls. Years passed, and the house stood still, its stories trapped inside. The locals kept their distance. The mansion was too dangerous, too filled with things best left alone. No one dared approach it until Aaron. Aaron was a young man, new to Briar's Hollow, a place he had come to escape the past that had been chasing him for too long. He didn't know the stories, didn't know the warnings. All he knew was that he was restless, and the mansion stood there, calling to him in a way he didn't fully understand. The storm had rolled in with a ferocity that rattled the windows and shook the earth. There was something about the way the night hung heavy in the air, a weight, a presence, as if the storm were more than just the weather. It was then that he found himself standing at the gate, staring up at the dark silhouette of the mansion on the hill. The wind howled, and for a moment Aaron thought he saw something move in the second floor window. A flicker of light, a shadow. It felt as if the mansion itself were waiting for him to come closer. He didn't hesitate. The storm pulled him in. He walked through the overgrown yard, the wet grass sticking to his boots, until he reached the front door, creaking on its hinges like a warning. Without thinking, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The air in the mansion was stale. It was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The floors creaked under his weight as he moved forward, but something inside of him kept pushing him up the stairs. His feet took him with an urgency he couldn't explain. Up, till he reached the second floor. The moment he stepped onto that floor, the temperature dropped sharply. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing cold air into him. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and endless, but at the far end, he saw at the window. It was wide open. The curtains billowed out like ghosts caught in an invisible breeze, their fabrics swaying with unnatural grace. For a moment, Aaron just stood there, staring at the empty space beyond the glass, trying to make sense of the silence that filled the room. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything was still. Something cold brushed against the back of his neck, a chill that made his skin crawl. He turned. There, in the farthest corner of the room, stood two figures, the figures of James and Clara. They weren't right. They were wrong. Their bodies twisted in unnatural angles, their limbs bent in ways that no human body should bend. Their eyes were hollow, Dark voids, unblinking, staring at him with an unyielding intensity. Their faces were frozen in expressions of silent agony, as if they had been trapped in that moment forever. Aaron took a step back, but the door slammed, shut behind him. The room darkened, and the only light came from the open window, casting an eerie glow across the figures. And then he heard it, a voice low, rasping, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have opened it." Aaron's breath hitched. He couldn't move. His legs wouldn't work, his body frozen in place. The figures didn't move. They just stared at him, their faces contorted in pain, as if they were trying to tell him something, but their mouths never moved. The air around him thickened, pressing in from all sides. The window wasn't just a window, it was a portal. Gateway to something worse, something darker than the storm that raged outside. And now that it was open, now that he had crossed that threshold, Aaron knew that there was no going back. The figures of James and Clara had once been human, just like him. But whatever was waiting beyond that window was hungry. The whispers came again, louder now, more urgent. "Come closer, ... Aaron knew it was too late. The mansion had claimed him. And just like James and Clara, he would never leave. Whispers in the walls. It was a typical evening in Eldridge Hollow, a quiet town where nothing much ever happened. The sun had just dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the houses. The kind of shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, giving the place an almost eerie feeling. Catherine Monroe had only recently moved into the old house on Church Street. She'd heard the rumors from her neighbors about strange noises coming from the house, a soft whispering, muffled voices, even knocking sounds that seemed to come from the walls. But Catherine, being the skeptic she was, didn't give them much thought. Old houses creaked and groaned. She had seen stranger things. However, as the days passed, the sounds grew harder to ignore. It was one evening, as Catherine sat curled up on the couch with a book, when she heard it. A faint whisper. It came from the wall beside her. "Come closer. ... Double quotes. Her heart skipped a beat. She set the book down, straining her ears. The voice wasn't clear, but it was there. And it was real. She stood up slowly, walking over to the wall. Pressing her ear against it, she felt the cold of the old plaster against her skin. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. She froze, a chill creeping down her spine. "Come closer. ... Suddenly, a sharp scratching sound erupted from inside the wall. It was as if something or someone was trying to claw its way out. Catherine's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. She pulled away from the wall, fear spreading through her like wildfire. The wall began to bulge. The shape inside twisted and shifted, pushing against the plaster from the inside. It looked like a dark, writhing mass, struggling to break free. Catherine's legs felt like they were made of lead. She tried to move, to run, but the door slammed shut, locking her inside. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she heard it again. That same whisper, "Come closer. ... The sound was so close now, as if it was. Right next to her ear. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to steady her breath, but the fear was overwhelming. The wall cracked. A tiny fracture spread across the plaster like a spider web, and through them, she saw something. A dark, shadowy figure. Something. Moving, something waiting for her on the other side. It wasn't human. It didn't have a face. Catherine's knees buckled. She wanted to scream, but her throat went dry. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. The shape in the wall seemed to grow larger, stretching toward her. The whispers intensified, coming from the space beyond the wall. A cold wind whipped around her, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. And then, through the cracks, she saw the shape finally pushing through. It was long and twisted, its limbs jerking unnaturally, its body oozing from the wall, like thick black ink. The creature inched closer, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. Its body was misshapen, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways, its eyes, if they could be called. Eyes were dark and hollow, glowing faintly. With a sickly light, the whispers were no longer just words. They were a chorus, hundreds of voices murmuring in her ears, in her mind, all of them urging her to come closer. They seemed to echo from deep within the creature, from somewhere beyond her reach, as if they came from a place far darker than anything she could comprehend. The temperature dropped to freezing, and Catherine shivered violently, her body trembling uncontrollably. She tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. Her legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in wet concrete. The creature's shape was fully formed now. It was more than a shadow, it was real. Its face began to form, grotesque and featureless. The surface of its skin flickering with strange patterns like an old television with a broken signal. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Come closer. The voice was unmistakable, now low, guttural, and piercing through her skull like a scream in the dead of night. It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. Her mind screamed for her too. Run, but her body betrayed her. She could feel it in the air, this oppressive weight, this pull that came from the thing in front of her. The whispers made her feel like she was suffocating. She couldn't think, she couldn't move. All she could hear was that voice. Come closer. Her vision blurred as the creature inched closer, its form growing more solid with each passing second. It was right in front of her now, and Catherine felt its coldness invade her very soul. Its breath, if it could be called that, was like ice against her skin. The room felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. It was waiting for her to reach out. And Catherine knew deep down that if she let herself go, the whispers would stop. The weight in the air would lift, and the creature would take her away into the dark, endless place beyond the wall. But then, something inside her snapped. A final, desperate surge of energy. Her hand moved, shaking, trembling towards the door with all her strength. Catherine pushed against the door, forcing it open. The air rushed back to her as the creature's form shifted behind her. She didn't look back. She ran. She ran until her legs burned, until she found herself outside. Standing in the cold, empty street, the whispering had stopped, but the feeling of dread still clung to her skin, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. But as Catherine looked up at the house from where she had escaped, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The walls were moving, and the whispers were still coming from inside. They were waiting for the next one to come closer.